financially. And rather than making them make hard decisions, they had the rest of the system begin to, as the chancellor said, cross-subsidize those universities. And so that became a drain on the larger universities, and in my opinion, is one reason why we're in such a drastic and dire situation that we are, and we're seeing so much pain being inflicted on the staff and the faculty and ultimately the students at the university.
Propping up is basically what IUP and the other larger universities have done for these smaller universities. And at some point, you're going to go down the wrong road too far and not be able to get back.
And when you had a blind eye to declining enrollment, and I do believe some of the decisions that IUP made years ago bear some responsibility in this, namely the overbuilding of student housing on campus. Now, that has been a difficult situation because their housing is now uncompetitive price-wise compared to the rest of the system. So that's part of the equation too. But the reality is we hit the iceberg years and years ago. We pretended that it never happened. And now all of a sudden we have no choice but to redirect the system. And as I sit here and I look at the system and the bureaucracy in the system, what we're paying for it, the conflict that the president has in terms of trying to be part of the system yet to maintain IUP. He's dealing with collective bargaining agreements that he didn't negotiate. So he's confined in terms of how he eliminates positions. And he doesn't have the flexibility, in my opinion, to make decisions in terms of curriculum and offerings to students, because all of that has to go through the bureaucracy of the system.
State system redesign is designed to actually reverse some of that effect. They're asking for $100 million a year over 5 years. If, as Chancellor Greenstein said, we don't get this fixed within a year, we're going to come back and we're going to say, let's dissolve the whole state system. Does that hurt the chances of getting the $500 million or even the $100 million for this year?
I don't think it does, because if anything, it probably enhances the chances. Most of the universities in the system could not stand on their own. And honestly, IUP is in a precarious of enough position that it may make that difficult in their own right. But, there is value, I think, to having a system structure if it's used correctly. And so my preference and my desire is certainly not to dissolve the bureaucracy of the system out of the gate. But at the end of the day, these universities, in my opinion, need to be able to rise and fall on their own. They need to have flexibility in the age of this new world to make decisions, make them quickly, and adapt to the demands of the student population. And I think that's what this is ultimately about.
Like what Chancellor Greenstein said yesterday about coming back next year, and if it hasn't worked, maybe dissolving the state system opened a lot of eyes yesterday.
It did. It opened my eyes. I never expected him to answer my question that way, but I commend him because he is coming in and he is speaking the truth. He is making hard decisions, and candidly, he's put his own position at risk. And I respect that. He came in here from the West Coast. He did not know Pennsylvania prior to his arrival, but he came in with an objective, and that was to right the ship of the system and make it a sustainable operation in this new reality.
All right, that's one of the conversations I wanted to have with you today, and that was certainly, as we said it in the news story, a bombshell that he dropped yesterday. There are some other issues I wanted to touch on with you today. One is your exchange last week with DEP. That also was at an Appropriations Committee budget hearing, and you pulled no punches, but didn't get a lot of answers out of DEP, did you?
No, and I followed it up yesterday with the Department of Education. I asked the Education Secretary if they've had any conversations about how they'll deal with our public school districts if the carbon tax comes to fruition, and they clearly have not. And so this whole guise of, well, we're going to work with effective communities is phony, because they haven't worked with us, and it's clear they've not even worked within the bureaucracy to come up with plans. DEP secretary says that they bring it up at cabinet meetings every 2 weeks, and yet I have the Secretary of Education who is at those cabinet meetings and says we've never had any real discussion on the impact on affected communities. So that's a real source of frustration for me. We're 9 months away, if the governor gets his way, from this tax being implemented, and these plants are in a fragile state as it is. The maintenance is already being deferred on them. The market is tough. They're in a very difficult position. They're probably going to have to make some adjustments as it is to try to survive. But if we put this carbon tax in place, it is the death knell of them. And we have to look at transitioning. We had a meeting with the DCED the day before, and a very good conversation about carbon capture sequestration technology. Consol Energy is developing a plant in Washington County or Greene County that would use carbon capture sequestration. It's a new technology. It's about 5 years away from coming into fruition, but my hope and my prayer is that that technology proves out and is something that we could replicate in our communities.
Absolutely. And that meeting at DCED was when they told you this firm that DEP hired to basically try to sell this whole Reggie plan, they'd never even heard of them.
Correct. Correct. So there's a massive disconnect. I don't see DCD talking to DEP. Obviously, nobody's talking to the Department of Education. And when you look at the three advisory committees that rejected this regulation, the Independent Regulatory Review Commission that rejected it, it's clear that the communication and the concern for how this is going to work is there, and it's real, and it's upside down. If you want to have a transition, and if we need to improve these power plants, then let's do it in a proactive way. And as I said to the DEP secretary, if you bring in a solar panel manufacturer and a windmill manufacturer and they employ 500 people and they pay $30 an hour and they have good benefits and they pay a strong property tax bill, I'll buy it then. Mm-hmm. But until I see that kind of outcome, I just don't believe anything they're telling us. I'll be darned if I'm going to let our coal-fired power plants prematurely shut down so they can build a solar plant manufacturer over in Montgomery County. That doesn't do us any good.
Yeah. Failure to communicate, a theme between the legislature and the administration. Yesterday in Washington, Dr. Levine was appearing before one of the committees in Washington, or actually it was her confirmation hearing, and she was asked about the nursing home situation with COVID-19 and the fact that Pennsylvania is not releasing the numbers of deaths of some of the nursing home. I'm not phrasing this correctly. The deaths of some of the nursing home residents due to COVID-19 patients being put back into the nursing home situation after having been hospitalized. Dr. Levine and the state itself, I think it was 138 nursing homes where there is still no data available, and the state is blaming systems, computers, but they're certainly not putting the numbers out there, are they?
They aren't, and I didn't see that exact exchange other than to read the headlines of it, but it has been the overriding criticism since the beginning of this pandemic. We knew very early on that the most significant impact of this virus was among the most vulnerable, and that was in our long-term care facilities. And instead of focusing on that, we shut down elements of our economy that should have never been shut down and allowed the crisis in the nursing homes to continue to go, candidly, I think, unabated. A lot of the nursing home facilities that I had talked to in the beginning were desperate for PPE and guidance and understanding of how to react and treat this. And then you have the whole issue of how COVID deaths are determined, the disputes with the coroners and the Department of Health, where they passed away versus where they lived, and how those were accounted for. I had one nursing home in Armstrong County that was being counted. The patient died in Butler Hospital, but they were trying to figure out where to count the death as whether or not it was Armstrong or Butler and attributed as a nursing home death or a hospital death. And there were all kinds of just massive inconsistencies that have led us to this point where our faith in understanding the true impact of the pandemic is not there.
Yeah, they've not regained the trust of a lot of people in that whole debate. And like I said, I didn't phrase it correctly, but that nursing home issue is one that gets under our skin
It
a lot
does. Mine
because
too. Because the other piece of that, Todd, I've talked to a lot of family members who want to simply get into the nursing homes and see their loved
I'm
ones.
one of them.
And their point is, what's the point of living if you can't be with your families and you can't communicate with your families and your loved ones? Then what good are we doing? I mean, isolation, there's a billboard on 2nd Street in Harrisburg that says isolation kills too. And that was a pretty powerful message to me. I just saw that this week. But that is something that I have heard firsthand from families that it's a real, real major issue.
We're going to have to say goodbye here in a second. I want to ask you this because I asked you this last time you were here. How's the state doing in terms of communicating and getting vaccine out? You said last time that, surprisingly, the state is doing the best they can and they're doing okay. How are they doing now?
It's been hit or miss. I have to tell you, just yesterday, the Department of Health sent out some new guidance that was sent to me by an independent pharmacy, and it was really incomprehensible. It was a multi-paragraph message about how we're not going to be giving you vaccines for several weeks because we have to recalibrate how we allocate them, and we're going to be up to almost 1 million vaccines a week, but it'll be several weeks before we go back to the pharmacy setting. And so we'll make sure you have the second shots, but you're not going to get any more first ones for a while. I don't know what that meant, to be honest.
Hmm.
And the Secretary of Health, again, I've said on this program before, I have a lot of respect for her. I know her personally, but the bureaucracy that she is trying to navigate here is impossible, and their messaging is just really off on this.
Yeah. Yeah, the lack of communication to the general public,
Yeah.
people that are simply waiting for their phone to ring.
Particularly when you expand the eligible communities, as we've talked before, when they took 1A and said, well, 65 and older, you're now eligible, the supply wasn't there. I mean, it gave false hope to a whole segment of the society, and that just wasn't healthy.
Yeah, you're right. All right, well, we thank you for coming in today and visiting with us. A lot of information coming out of Harrisburg, and we appreciate your time.
My pleasure, Todd. Anytime.
He is Senator Joe Pittman. It is the voice of Indiana County, WCCS 101.1 FM and AM 1160.